It's 1956 and you are the CEO of a big auto company. You want to make more money, and for you, more money means more cars. But you know what cars need? Lanes.
Now imagine that it is the late 1950s and you live in one of Chicago's neighborhoods. You buy pastries in your local bakery, visit the park on the weekend, and go shopping in the local corner store. By the 1960s, however, instead of a bakery with your favorite cupcakes and the park where you walked your dog, there is a highway.
This new highway took away your beloved bakery, park, and corner shop, but it brought some new things to your everyday life, such as noise, traffic, and mobility. Mobility, that is, if you own a car. Now you might consider moving to the suburbs, but a big city is just so convenient, so you start to wonder.
What if there is a way for you to have the best of both worlds? Still be a step away from the services and the job market of a big city, but come back to a beautiful white fenced house with a green yard every day. You would need a car, of course, but with a cheaper rent outside the city, that could absolutely be affordable. The birds are chirping, the kids have a yard to play, and there is no traffic. It just checks all the boxes.
Hello and welcome to What the City, the show where we cannot stop talking about city planning and urbanization. Seriously, 25 minutes was a struggle. I am your co-host, Natalia.
And I am your other co-host, Luda. And today we're going to talk about suburbanization.
More specifically, how did the creation of the interstate highway system in the 1950s contribute to the massive process of suburbanization that took place in the US after World War II?
Is suburbanization bad? Are cars bad? Did one cause the rise of the other? There are plenty of questions we can't fully answer when it comes to these subjects. And even if we could, the answers would certainly depend on individual perspectives and our prior experiences. Now, the important thing here is to trace the relationship between American car-centric culture and suburbanization and how the two work alongside each other. We hope this will be an enjoyable and informative 25 minutes. Be sure to listen all the way through for the details, stats, stories, and fun facts. Before the end of World War II, according to the US Department of Defense, US leaders realized that nearly 16 million American men and women who were serving in the armed forces would be unemployed when the war finally ended, which, aside from being a problem in and of itself, brought bitter memories of the not-so-long-gone Great Depression.
To avoid that, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, also known as the GI Bill, was signed into law by President Roosevelt 2 weeks after the invasion of Normandy. Its aim was to help veterans buy homes, get jobs, and pursue an education, and in general, help them to adjust to civilian life again. In the 1950s, the US was booming and blooming.
But how is it even possible to build so much so fast? Well, when we think mass production, the iconic scene is cars, right? But mass production could also be considered when we're talking about building houses, leading to what was called mass construction.
Why not apply to the building of houses the same principles that have brought other American industries to their unexcelled peaks of efficiency and service? Why not mass produce the elements that go to make up a house, just as the auto industry does with the parts that go into a new car?
Mass construction, new technology, and the availability of workers made the rise of the suburbia possible.
Now, as much as we love ourselves some hashtag multiple causes, let's talk more about cars and suburbia specifically. So what is up with that and that relationship?
Well, this combination creates a positive feedback loop. Suburbs were by definition further away and somewhat sectorized. So you had a huge, strictly residential areas with shopping centers, which you had to drive to. And of course, one could walk, but if we go by that reasoning, one could technically walk anywhere. This doesn't fit with the modern life. The point is that the cars enabled life in the suburbs because they kept residents connected.
Yeah, but what about the other way around? So we talked about how cars enabled suburbs, but how did suburbs enable cars?
Yeah, the growth of suburban population increased the demand for cars, precisely because cars and suburban housing have such a symbiotic relationship. In fact, I think cars were the reason why suburban life could be so enjoyable, since they enable having the best of both worlds: charming, cheaper countryside life with the mobility of urban centers.
That is very, very true. And as we've said before, cars need infrastructure, right? So I think we'd put it as cars need lanes, and that's just how it ties into the interstate highway system. As President Eisenhower put it in a news conference in 1956,
we need highways badly, very badly, and I'm in favor of any forward constructive step in this field.
Of course, Eisenhower was speaking from a particular perspective. He had been inspired by the German Autobahns, and he believed that newer, multi-lane highways were essential to a strong national defense, which is understandable considering the constant participation of the US in wars during the mid-20th century, and that Eisenhower had participated in both world wars and had had a military career from an early age. Anyways, going back to the highways, it was a huge project that aimed to integrate the entire country on a macro level, but also ended up integrating states and putting a lot of places on the map. Speaking of the 1950s, we can't talk about highways in the US without bringing the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, also known as the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act.
Sure, that is a very famous act, but there were also plenty of federal aid acts in the decades preceding 1956. There was 1916, the 1921 Act, 1944, 1952, all before 1956. So what is so special about this one?
Well, first of all, the amount of funding in the 1956 Act was much larger than the largest sum allocated before, which was about $1.5 billion in the 1944 Act, which covered the fiscal years of 1946, 47, and 48. The federal aid in the 1956 Act was of $25 billion. And it was specifically dedicated to the construction of 41,000 miles of the interstate highway system. It was also a 19-to-10 split between the federal government and the state government, while most of the previous funding programs had a 50-50 split.
And well, that clearly had an impact. In 1956, the interstate system consisted of 1,578 miles, the longest road being the I-70 that crossed Kansas and Missouri, the first highway built with federal funding from the 1956 Act. 1 year later, in 1957, the mileage had tripled. By 1962, 6 years later, it reached 10,000 miles, and 20 years later, in 1976, it reached almost 34,000 miles. Just for comparison, in 2018, the number was close to 48,000.
Wow.
So now that we've talked a lot about cars and roads, let's go back to suburbanization. So let's try to first eliminate any confusion. Luda, what is suburbanization as we know it today?
So usually when we talk about suburbanization, we consider the development and growth of the suburbs, the areas on the outskirts of big cities. When these neighborhoods appear in the suburbs, the relocation of these urban districts causes urban sprawl, which is uncontrolled growth of our metropolitan areas. To understand what urban sprawl is in terms of today, think of, for example, LA and its size.
But many suburban residents still work in the city or in its central part, thus intentionally choosing to live further away from their workspace and having to commute to work.
Yes, that's absolutely true. But commuting to work in the 1950s was not an issue at all, since there were more significant reasons, which we formally call pull factors, that made people want to move to the suburbs. For instance, living in the residential neighborhood allowed a family to live in a safer, friendlier, and even more peaceful environment and be closer to nature, along with paying smaller taxes. And who doesn't love smaller taxes?
I've also read that the property prices were lower as well, which meant that it was cheaper to pay a home mortgage in a suburb than in the city, with a difference of approximately $61, which today doesn't mean that much, but back then was not an insignificant sum of money.
Yeah, that's so much. But what was so bad about the cities in the 1950s as well?
Well, the issues of the cities are summarized by what we call the push factors that contributed to making people want to flee the city. Things such as traffic, noise, pollution, overpopulation, criminal activity, and class divisions were all driving people away from the major cities.
But like actually driving people away. So here we return back to the car boom that made transitioning from life with the push factors to the life with pull factors possible.
Yes, I totally agree. And I think that because taking public transport from downtowns to the suburbs was not plausible due to poor transportation systems, cars ended up fulfilling the need for mobility, both physical and symbolic. They would physically take you from place to place and would make the world feel accessible to you at all times.
That's true. But at the same time, when the suburbanization was unfolding in the USA, there were contrarians who did not see it as a positive thing. Thus, questions about administrations arose, such as who provides services in the suburbs. Another problem was that the cities were now restricted by the suburban neighborhoods, and they were only able to grow upwards within their borders.
I guess this also meant that city planners needed to approach new construction very cautiously and think if housing is the best choice for the land, also considering if the new development can be effectively placed within the larger metropolitan complex.
So now let's discuss the nature of American suburbs in the 1950s.
Yes, should we start with the idea of white flight?
Yeah, that's a great starter.
This concept encapsulates the migration of white people of European ancestry from racially diverse urban areas to areas that were more homogeneous and suburban, with the goal to distance themselves from racial minorities. And that was also made possible due to the rise of the car.
So this indeed created predominantly white neighborhoods since members of the minorities were left behind in the city slums. Also, I guess the idea of sameness was very large in the suburbs since most people were at the similar stages of life, had similar income levels, and lived in pretty much extremely similar settings.
Kind of democratic, isn't it? Or perhaps even socialist if we want to bother some people. Since the economic boom really elevated families to the middle class.
Yes, but despite the rapid economic growth in the US, there were additional incentives from the federal government, such as the GI Bill of 1944 that offered World War II veterans guaranteed loans to buy homes or even businesses.
And we know how the story goes. The bill is for everyone, but it was mostly used by the white communities that had easier access to the governmental benefits. And when you have easier access, you are more likely to get a car to move to the suburbs.
So what happened to the minorities when they couldn't move to the suburbs?
Well, what do you do when you can't move? You usually stay exactly where you are. So they predominantly stayed in the city neighborhoods, which were often sliced by highways built in the 1950s. An example of this is the Garfield Park neighborhood in Chicago, whose character was destroyed with the construction of the Eisenhower Expressway.
I think it is sad that the Eisenhower Expressway killed two birds with one stone, so it both retrofitted the city for the cars and cleared out the slums. It is said that between 1948 and 1956, more than 6,000 families in the Chicago area lost their homes to the so-called highway takes.
Indeed, I think the most fascinating thing is that its initial purpose was to connect people and bring them to the city, while it ended up doing the exact opposite. So it separated the communities and it made people want to flee Chicago.
And those who stayed were left in the cities at the pretense that their mere presence in the suburbs would lower the property values. Can you imagine that? And all the factors combined, you get places like Levittown in the New York, which was for whites only.
Oh, Levittown, that is pretty fascinating. It was the first suburban community in the US, and the company that built it, Levitt & Sons, then proceeded to build similar neighborhoods in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The place was all about equality, but not racial, only architectural.
Ah, right. Yeah, I think one of our sources talked about how people would sometimes mistake someone else's house for their own, since everything looked identical. But getting back to it, Levitt was just a home builder and not really a social engineer. Thus, we end up in an extremely whitewashed environment.
In other neighborhoods, though, such as Park Forest Village in Chicago, guidance was actually offered to the employees on how to deal with integration of minorities into the suburb.
Yeah, true. And even if such attempts were made, people still needed a car to commute to their workspaces in the city. So, by default, if the family did not have a car, they did not have access to a suburban life.
And aside from racial segregation, we can see how other aspects of the social order played out here. There was a particular group of people living in the suburbs who were supposed to enjoy the mobility of cars, but were actually not fully capable of doing so.
Ah, yes, the women. Some of them indeed seemed very trapped. The car would be the prerogative of the man of the house, who would go to work daily, meaning that housewives were often left prisoners of their suburban life. So in 1955, according to the US Census Bureau, the average of cars per person was approximately 0.3. And in the 1960s, almost 60% of households had one car, while a little over 20% had none, or roughly the same percentage had two cars. This means that it is more likely that families shared one car, deprioritizing stay-at-home women. In fact, this is what they would probably tell us.
You know, 3 weeks ago, I couldn't have accepted that invitation. Like so many people these days, we live in the suburbs, and Dave needs the car every day for business. When he was gone, I was practically a prisoner in my own home. I couldn't get out to see my friends, couldn't take part in PTA activities. I couldn't even shop when I wanted to. I had to wait till Thursday night after Dave brought the car home.
This is a part of a Ford ad telling people to become two Ford families and enjoy the pleasure of mobility provided by having two fine Fords over one expensive car.
3 weeks ago, we bought another Ford, the new low-priced custom line Victoria. Isn't it stunning? Dave has it all to himself, and I now have the ranch wagon all to myself. It's a whole new way of life. Now I'm free to go anywhere, do anything, see anybody anytime I want to. It's only good common sense. Why be stuck with one expensive car when you can enjoy all the fun and freedom of two fine Fords?
That is all really interesting, but I think we should take some time to look at what this mid-century phenomenon has left us with. Just off the top of my mind, I think air pollution is a pretty evident effect of the rise of fossil fuels, to this day very associated with motor vehicles, which is always good to remember that includes trucks and buses as well as automobiles.
Yes, that is absolutely true, and it makes a lot of sense when we look at the change in number of cars. So this section is a bit mass heavy, so prepare yourselves. In 1955, a staggering near 63 million motor vehicles were on record, 52 of which were private or commercial automobiles. In 1975, the number jumped to 133 million motor vehicles, over 106 million of which were automobiles.
Wow, that is a lot.
Just wait for it. So by 2015, motor vehicles registered amounted to almost 264 million. But there's an interesting twist. So the number of automobiles, which accounted for 75% of the motor vehicles in 1975, didn't rise much in 30 years. In fact, in 2015, there were only about 40% of those 264 million. Mysterious, huh?
As for the suburban population, it just keeps on growing. According to the US Census Bureau, in 1950, 33% of the population lived in central cities, whereas 23% were in the suburbs. Between 1950 and 2000, the metropolitan population, those who live in a central city and in their suburbs, went from 56% of the US population to 80%. But the percentage of the population in central cities remained almost constant, while the suburban population went from 23% in 1950 to 50% in 2000. Quite the dramatic change in proportion.
Yes, absolutely. And comparing this to today, where we have 4 out of 5 people living in the suburbs in the US, that is quite insane. So let's zoom out here. To sum things up, today we attempted tracing the connection between the rise of the car and the process of suburbanization in the 1950s United States. We discussed many things, among which were the causes and effects of suburbanization and the role of the car in it as a constant driver of change, turning the US into a car-centered nation. Thus, the mass migration to the suburbs was symptomatic of the new power dynamics that shaped racial relations, gender roles, and American identity.
So I guess this means that people are still, quote, making it to the suburbs, unquote, huh? Is that the new definition of American dream? Will moving to the suburbs ultimately lead to more cars, bigger roads, denser city centers? Those are all important questions that we need to look into, but that is for another episode of What the City? Well, Luda, looks like our car ride is here, so If you made it this far into the podcast, it was lovely to have you listen to us, and we hope that this will get your brain engines turning when you see those familiar suburb houses from now on.
Yes, always a pleasure to nerd out about urbanization and city planning. See you all soon for our next episode.